Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Ask an Addiction Specialist. I'm Bob Weathers.
Odie Martinez.
The two of us are really appreciative of your being back with us this week. Let me say a few words by way of introduction, then we'll dive into today's topic. I wanted to give a context for my contribution here, as I'm a professor of clinical psychology here locally at California Southern University, and I mention that because we'll be looking at addiction and recovery and topics that are related to that, and I'm coming primarily from a psychological perspective. There are multiple perspectives. I work closely, for example, with physicians who operate primarily from a biomedical perspective, and I bring more of a psychosocial perspective, and our conversations will bear that out. So that's part of my background. I'm involved with doctoral students who are completing doctoral dissertations addressing addiction and recovery. It's a real joy of mine to work with them, and I bring the latest breaking news from the work that I do working with these doctoral students. Secondly, I work as a recovery coach. In fact, I'm just coming this week, as I do each Wednesday, from Beginnings Treatment Centers. I want to mention them because Beginnings sponsors this weekly podcast, and also want to locate the work that we talk about here in the context of the work that I'm doing, working with individuals and families who are in recovery from addiction. Want to thank our two co-producers, Franz Salvatierra and Austin Armstrong, who are in the studio with us today. Austin will be fielding questions that you have, comments that you have for Odie and myself. Encourage you to submit questions. We were joking earlier about this. Maybe we'll do a reverse psychology. Do not submit questions and see what happens. Actually, override that. We would love to have your interaction with us. Want to encourage you to share the link to this podcast with friends of yours if you find it valuable, as well as to know that there are YouTube videos as well as archived videos of all previous podcasts at Beginnings Treatment Centers. You can look that up, as well as in the Facebook group, Ask an Addiction Specialist. There's multiple roads to Rome here. Encourage you to access and to share what it is that we discuss. I'll be referring to some previous podcasts later today that we've done earlier, and you'll find access to those in the archives, okay? So, and also by way of kind of creating a context. Last week we talked about how it is that we lose ourselves and can find ourselves again. And I refer you to that podcast with Odie and me if you have an interest in checking that out. I think each podcast kind of builds on the previous ones. I think it's the value of seeing some of the prior ones, and you're very welcome to consult with those. And you're also welcome to write questions or comments if you view those through YouTube or through the Facebook group. And later on, I'll give you even link to my website. There are all kinds of ways to communicate to me questions that come up for you, and I encourage that. I really would love to stay in interaction with you. So thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Today's topic is practice makes perfect. I want to tell a story, first of all, about golf. Okay, I'll share this story with you, and then we'll dive into the material today around practice makes perfect. About 4 years ago, owing to a shoulder surgery on my right side, I had been playing some golf on a weekly basis. I'm not a great golfer, but I was playing regularly with a colleague from the university. I had to stop because of the shoulder surgery on my right side. And my shoulders have received a lot of use. I'm not going to say abuse. They received a lot of use in my life. I was a competitive tennis player all the way through my middle years. I played a lot of tennis. My right shoulder has borne the brunt of that, and I've had 2 shoulder surgeries there. My left shoulder is currently getting some attention. I've had 2 shoulder surgeries on the left side. That's owing to skiing and my deciding that I wanted to become airborne as a skier. And probably the central aggravator of this, which is one of the key pleasures of my life, is that I've drummed my entire life, and so my shoulders have borne a lot of activity. And so my golf career ended 4 years ago until last night. I went out last night to the local driving range, and I want to begin to pick up golf again. And it turns out that I can play golf even with a little bit of a limited left shoulder, because my right shoulder is probably more involved in that. So I went out last night, and what I discovered was that I suck. 4 years of not practicing is very unforgiving. And for any of you that are golfers, you know that it's very sensitive to nuance. And not golfing for 4 years does not count as nuance. It's like a massive crater in the midst of my golf career. And so what I resorted to last night was I decided that with each one of my clubs, I started with the biggest one, the driver. With each one of them, if I could get 1 out of 5 shots, have this whole bucket of balls, if I get 1 out of 5 shots that was halfway decent, I would consider that as a success. Now, honestly, Odie and our audience, I didn't really reach that goal with some of the clubs. I did not hit 1 out of 5 good shots, or I should say decent shots, with all of the clubs. But I went through all the clubs, and then I came back and did it again, and I kind of sort of got 1 out of 5 shots. I never did get the direction exactly the way I wanted it to, but if I could get a shot that was airborne, I considered that one. Okay. And so it was a small world phenomenon. I was there golfing thinking that this is embarrassing because I really am not doing very well, at which point somebody called out, "Hey, Dr. Bob." And I looked over, and there was an entire group from Beginnings Treatment Center that was going there for their weekly ritual, none of which I knew. And so there was a whole crowd of people that I lead groups with today watching me suck. Which, of course, helped me a lot. Being self-conscious when you're golfing really aids you in terms of your skills. No, it didn't.
I think with golf, you can kind of get away with that, though, because a group of friends that I had up in New York, we had like a local driving range / golf course.
Right.
And we would go there on the weekends. None of us knew how to play.
Okay.
So we were out there like, I don't know if you ever seen the episode of The Three Stooges when they're out there.
I lived it yesterday.
So that was us. So I kind of get away with that.
Yeah. I think they were probably more, this oftentimes goes this way. I think they were more forgiving of my ineptitude than I was, for sure. Actually, I kind of settled into it. I want to use this story about golf and about inexperience and about where we're going today as kind of a metaphor for talking about how it is that practice makes perfect. I do want to say this. I made a vow last night as I was leaving to come back next week. I'm going to come back next Tuesday night, and my wish is to come back and golf again and see if I can aim towards that 1 out of 5. And I actually have some fair confidence that if I stick with this at least once a week, that I might get up to 2 out of 5 at some point in this lifetime, and that would be a success for me. So let me transition from talking about golf to talking about shame, and in my case, those aren't so different. They're quite related to each other. I want to kind of open this up into a dialogue with my friend Odie and our kind of examine this together. And I've got a direction that I want to go, but we can kind of improvise as we go. I do want to talk about shame as a discrete state, and the metaphor to golf is that I did get some good shots. I was going to say I never hit the ball where I intended to. There were actually a few times that I did, and those would be very discrete states, okay, surrounded by lots of the balls being topped, which is they just roll, and or going, I hit them and they go in the wrong direction. And I think that all of us have some sense of what it's like to be in a moment where we feel acute shame in a specific instance. And I want to open it up for you and I to talk for just a minute. Maybe to start by talking about what does shame feel like as a discrete event, when it occurs just momentarily. Where do we feel it in our bodies? I wonder if you might reflect on that, if you'd be willing, Odie, when you've been embarrassed or ashamed or humiliated, and I'll do the same.
You know, what usually happens for me when I feel shame is I feel it in my shoulders. Sometimes I even notice that, like, almost like a turtle.
Yeah.
You know, I start going like this.
Yeah.
And then I just, at times I just want to just wish I was a turtle and just kind of just hide in my shell.
I'm smiling not at your experience because there's nothing funny to be smiling about shame, but I was just in Texas this weekend visiting my daughter and my 2 grandchildren.
Nice.
We were out on a golf course. That's what set this in motion.
Okay.
We were out just getting a tour of the golf course because my daughter and her family live right up next to a golf course now, and so we were getting a tour in a golf cart. And my grandson, my daughter's son, Owen, spotted a turtle on the golf course, and he went running towards it. The turtle was kind of moseying along, and predictably, what did the turtle do? It went just what you talked about. Its head went in the shell, and its legs went up in the shell. And Owen was quite fascinated with this,
Yeah.
and so he went up there and saw the turtle stop, freeze, and then as he walked away, we watched the turtle's head come out, kind of look around, and legs come out, and the turtle began to move quickly to get the heck out of Dodge, because it could.
Yeah.
And it's all, I think it's a great image. It's a great image of shame, and in a sense, that turtle's freeze response is very, very similar to what happens in shame, because shame is a freeze response as well.
Yeah.
It paralyzes us. I ask the groups that I lead, in fact, I just asked the group today that I led, and people talked about feeling it in their stomach. You talk about it in your shoulders.
Right.
One person talked about his head in terms of his mind spinning. Another person talked about heart palpitating. We all experience it differently, but the fact is that each one of us can identify times that we've been really ashamed or acutely embarrassed, and we feel it very physically. It's a discrete state of mind and actually state of body.
Yeah.
I also want to talk about shame as a stage. That would be the next slide. That there's shame as a discrete state. It's also possible, and I want to open into imagining into this, that we can experience shame with more permanence. And so rather than just a state, I'm thinking of it like a stage of development psychologically, emotionally, relationally, where we just kind of get stuck at a certain stage or a certain level, you might say. And it's a different way to understand shame, which is that it's not that I'm, it would be almost like if I go with your image, Odie, it'd be like I'm kind of constantly with that turtle with my shoulders like this. And you can probably relate to that. I can certainly relate to myself, where you're just kind of walking around chronically with, it could be literally tautness in your shoulders, or for me, a queasiness in my gut is kind of where I seem to locate it. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Makes perfect sense.
So if I go back to the golf metaphor, is that it's possible to get relief from that momentarily, to get relief from that. Even if I walk around chronically with my shoulders like a turtle, or my stomach doing flip-flops, I can experience momentary relief. That would be a way to understand healing as a state. You can experience temporary healing of that, relief from that. I would say that yesterday, every few shots, I hit a really good shot, and I experienced healing.
Yeah.
From the previous stage, probably, of frustration and somewhat of shame. I'm overdoing the shame, but there was some there. In fact, for sure there was some there, because I happened to be right next to the guy getting lessons from the golf pro.
Yeah.
And so they're right behind me, and the pro is really good. That's why they call him pro.
Yeah.
And his student is obviously a good learner, and I'm right over here next to them, flubbing up. And so there was some embarrassment, there was some shame, but every once in a while I get a good shot, and at least in my mind's eye, I look back over my shoulders. Did you see that? That's pretty cool. So there's a momentary kind of healing of said shame for just a second. Yeah. So there's a state. But where we want to head today is it possible to imagine healing from shame as itself being permanent? Which is to say, healing as a stage. And by stage, again, I mean kind of a level of operating most of the time, of not being swamped by turtle feelings, or by stomach earthquake feelings. Yeah. So the example I want to give is one from childhood for me. When I was 14 years old, my family moved. We lived in Central California. We moved to a new town the week before my first day of high school. So I literally went to high school the first day, did not know a soul in this town, which means no soul that I know on campus. And that was very scary for a 14-year-old. I'm right on the cusp of adolescence, kind of just moving into it, and kind of at the height of self-consciousness. And so I haven't thought of it till right this moment. Talk about vulnerability to shame, because I'm coming onto campus, and by definition I'm other than everybody on campus, because I'm a foreigner. Yeah. And I went into my first class, my first day of high school as a 14-year-old, and it was a German class. I was taking German, which in Central California is an odd phenomenon, because Spanish would be the more practical option. Both my older brothers had taken Spanish, and I took it on myself to take German. And I think I was doing it just to be different. So it's not enough that I'm different, moving into a new town, first day of high school, don't know a soul,
Right.
but I'm taking a language that no one in the Central Valley speaks.
Yeah.
It's not known for its German-speaking population. That's one of the luckiest decisions I made, one of the most blessed decisions, because it turns out that my German teacher, we called him Herr Hayes, Mr. Hayes, ended up becoming a lifelong mentor to me. And I met him the very first day of high school, and I took German for 4 years. It wasn't enough to take it for 1 year. I took German for 4 years. So I developed quite advanced capacities to speak and read and write in German.
Very nice.
And there was no audience for that. I did get to go to Germany after high school, and I was grateful because I was fluent in German at that point. But that first day, I wasn't.
Yeah.
And so the very first week, we went into what was called the language lab. And I remember sitting at a desk, or it was actually a carrel. It was had little sides like this, so you had a little private little partition. And there was a microphone there. And Mr. Hayes, Herr Hayes, would be up in front, and he'd listen to each person enunciating German. And he had little earphones on. He could correct your pronunciation, and he would just go up and down the class like this. So we'd be reading German words, German vocabulary words, reading sentences, and he would correct this. I did that for 4 years of getting that attention, but this is my first experience of it. And I remember looking up behind Mr. Hayes' head, and on the wall behind his head was the next slide. And it said, Übung macht den Meister. Übung macht den Meister. What does that mean? Well, I didn't know at the beginning, but I had 4 years of staring at that to find out that Übung means practice, macht means makes,
Okay.
den means the, and Meister means master. And so literally translated, that would be practice makes the master. And that's what we want to talk about today.
Yeah.
And so the term that we use more typically, I don't think we use that word, we use the term practice makes perfect. But I'd like to argue that I think there's some wisdom to the German version. Üben macht den Meister,
Yeah.
practice makes the master. And I want to talk about what I mean by that. Our typical way of understanding perfection, and this will get into shame in just a second, whether it's golf or life, our typical usage of the word perfect or perfection in English translates as being without fault or
Yeah.
defect. That's typically what we mean,
Yeah.
that there's no fault, there's no defect. As fate would have it, it wasn't enough for me to study German, which no one spoke in Central California. Just a few years later in college, I decided that I would study ancient Greek. I wasn't even studying contemporary Greek. And so there's no one on the planet that speaks ancient Greek. Don't ask me why. I guess because maybe my brothers didn't study it. I don't know. So I studied ancient Greek early in college, and I took an intensive year's course and was immersed in studying ancient Greek. And what I learned studying ancient Greek is that the Greeks, well, there's an interesting piece, and you'll appreciate this,
Yeah.
is that the Christian New Testament is the original language for it that was written in was Greek. And so it gave me the capacity, for example, to read the New Testament in its earliest form, the ancient Greek form. And the term that's translated in the Christian New Testament, as well as Greek mythology, the term that's translated as perfect, for example, Jesus says, "Be ye perfect as I am perfect."
Yeah.
That term perfect in the ancient Greek connotes something different than our word in English does. Now the plot thickens. And so the ancient Greek understanding of perfect had less to do with being without limitation or without defect or without any kind of fault,
Right.
rather than it means to be whole or to be complete. And so it's to be whole or complete. And you might think, well, why are we quibbling over this? I think that difference is an important difference.
Yeah, I think so too.
To be perfect in the latter sense means to be a whole person. To be perfect in the other sense means to have no faults. And to be without fault is quite impossible for us as humans.
Absolutely.
To be whole, which would be to whole as you are, to be whole as you are, to be complete as you are, Odie, or me, Bob, that seems quite possible.
Yeah.
So rather than the goal being one of being flawless, it's about one of wholeness. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I like that a lot better than perfect, because perfect is just kind of, in the English sense of it, language sense of it, it's kind of a high standard to try to go for, and
exactly. It's impossible. It sets us up for guaranteed failure because none of us can be that. Yeah. So if we go back to the idea of Meister, from Übung macht den Meister, practice makes the master, what would it be to become a Meister in this latter sense, the way that we're talking about perfection? It gets interesting, and I want to, I want to tell a story about that for sure, and then I want to open it up to dialogue. I want to tell a story and see what it triggers for you. Does that sound okay?
Yeah.
And for you in the audience. I started studying psychology 40 years ago. Actually, 41 years ago, this fall. It's a long time ago. And we studied shame. And we found definitions of shame, and we've talked about it here, which is some sense of there being that I'm inherently defective,
right?
Which would be the opposite of the English understanding of perfection. Its opposite would be to be ashamed, to be fully aware of my lack of perfection, my being broken or defective. And so I studied shame as part of what we study in psychology, and sort of studying human emotions, particularly human emotions that cause distress, including depression and other, and addiction. But I never felt identified with it. I wrote papers on shame. We were required to write those, so I could actually write an essay on shame. But I always felt like I don't know if it was ever quite this way, but I'm going to say I sure feel sorry for those people that are ashamed of themselves. And proceeded through graduate school, proceeded through licensure as a psychologist, got into my career, and then began to head down a rabbit hole for me that was a very gradual process of becoming more and more addicted to substance and more vulnerable to making really monumentally poor decisions in my life. And in the process, lost my career in psychology as a licensed psychologist, lost my career as a university professor, lost professional stature, lost financial security, etc. And then for the first time in my life had a lengthy exposure to an immersion in, I would say, personal shame. So what I'd read about before that was at arm's length was now upfront and quite personal for me. And so we can look back in the last 10 years on the heels of so much loss, and finally a stopping of all of that to realize, soul searching, what am I going to do? Am I going to continue down this path and just completely destroy my life, or is there the possibility of redemption and healing? And I made the latter decision, but it wasn't like overnight. In other words, it was a gradual process. And so what I want to share here is that what I began in earnest about half a dozen years ago, and we've talked about it here. I want to refer you all back to previous podcasts that we've had on topics such as forgiveness, gratitude, and personal creativity. Those are three examples. I began to practice in my early morning quiet time and in my day-to-day kind of routines, began to practice things that I'd never done before. And this gets us back to the idea of daily practice. And as I began to practice, I want to say that when I started this process, this is probably an underestimate. I think I was operating day to day, if you had met me during that time, that 90% of the time, and that's probably being generous, 90% of the time I was completely swamped by self-mortification. I felt awful about myself, what I had done, and I couldn't get out of it. In fact, as I've shared here before, if I was sitting with you, Odie, I would actually imagine you looking at me through the eyes that I was experiencing. So I couldn't imagine being with you and doing anything other than judging me.
Right. Yeah.
Because I was merciless in it, and how could you be other than that? And this isn't a theory for me, that was a daily experience for me. And it led to incredible distress for me. And you can imagine the depression, the anxiety, the vulnerability to addiction. All of that was going on for me, even in early recovery from addiction. So one of the things I set about doing was getting myself clear of the addictive behaviors, and so I began working on that. None of that happened overnight either for me, but there was a gradual beginning to kind of at least have the resources for being able to internalize self-forgiveness or self-compassion. And I practiced that religiously almost every day of the week, at least once in the morning. And as it began to be more habitual through the day. And so I don't know if this is accurate or not, but I roughly would say this, is that I moved from a previous state of a permanent stage of being in shame, in self-judgment, only feeling defective, to right now, which is 10% of the time, I can feel all those things.
Yeah.
And it's probably an underestimate of the 90% and probably an overestimate of the 10%, but just for simplicity's sake, the movement was from a permanent stage, 90% Bob Weathers is in a shame stage, to nowadays Bob Weathers continues to be vulnerable, and maybe 10% of the time he's vulnerable to a state of being shamed. Does that make sense so far?
Absolutely. Okay.
Actually, I care more about this than golf.
Yeah.
I would like to move, though, it's kind of a reverse thing. Right now, I told you 1 out of 5 shots might be decent. Maybe 1 out of 10 shots. If I could get to a place where 1 out of 10 shots are great or good, that'd be good. I'd like to move the opposite direction. I'd like to move to a place where I can count on my shots that 90% of the time that they would be reliable. That's unlikely to happen in this lifetime, realistically. But I'd like to move to that perspective. But if you flip it around and look at shame, we're talking about reducing shame. We're talking about maximizing or optimizing golf game. We're talking about minimizing or reducing shame. And I guess what I want to do is I want to start by just acknowledging that it's possible to turn the ship around. And it's amazing that that's possible to do that we can retrain old reflexes. Sometimes I think about it in terms of like a knee-jerk reflex, is that if you hit that place below your knee every time it kicks, and if you look at that as an image of the way it used to be for me for shame, anytime you looked at me, I'd go into a mortal state of shame. And nowadays, you'd have to very actively shame me. And this is what I mean by 10%. If you really wanted to make me feel bad, you could come up with something that would be hugely critical of me. You could probably pick up on some of my history, most of which I've found some relationship to in terms of acceptance. But you could pick up on something, and I'll talk more about this in terms of messages in a few moments, and you could shame me, and I'm not impervious to that. I'm not Teflon boy. You could actually get underneath my skin, and I could go into a state of shame. And at least so far, knock on wood, that's as good as it gets for me, but it's a massive change for me to move from a permanent stage to a temporary state, and I'm utterly grateful for that. How does that sit so far? Does this make sense, what we're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. It's can relate a lot to my history and my life with what I've shared before as well with pornography and whatnot. Just how that switch that happens, it's awesome. It's a beautiful thing, you know, when it's 90% shame and it just keeps cycling, as we talked about before as well. And then having that freedom of not being attached to that shame, to the addiction that I once had, and being able to look back in hindsight and see the change that happened.
Yeah. I like you're using the term freedom, Odie, because as we've talked about before, addiction comes from the Latin root of the word addictus, which simply means slave. And so I think about my addiction, and I think it's implied in what you're saying. Think about addiction as enslavement. And there's something about that moves it from being a medical term or a psychiatric or psychological term into being a human term. Enslavement. You know about enslavement. I know about enslavement. And the healing of that leads to freedom or liberation. And you've experienced that, and I have too, and I'm very grateful for that. Some of the manifestations of that freedom for me, and I've written a couple of slides here. One is that I've moved. I can really feel this difference. And it's documented in my journaling, it's documented in my life, is that I'm far less likely to blame you or other people at this point for things that you may have done that have hurt or offended me. Because I'm much more inclined to forgive you, and I guess that's, I know that that's based on the fact, or very intimately related to the fact, that I tend not to shame myself for doing things that hurt you. I won't feel good about it. And as we talked about before, I'll feel guilty about that, which will motivate me to change, but I don't move into that paralyzed state or that enslavement to shame that I once knew. And so just as I can empathize with those that suffer now in new ways because I've known suffering, I can also empathize with myself. And we talk about that in terms of self-forgiveness or self-compassion, and that's a new commodity for me. when I was back writing those papers on shame in college and in graduate school, I wasn't identified with it. And now it's not a theory, it's a direct experience. I know what it's like to live in a nearly constant state of shame, of self-judgment, of not being able to get outside of that. And so it does feel like freedom. It does feel like liberation to have some other option. In fact, that other option to be the more constant state right now.
Yeah.
Let me ask a question of you in the audience as you're with us today, reflecting on this. If you have any taste for what we're talking about in terms of a more permanent permanent stage of affairs, that is to say, if you live in a place where you doubt yourself, where you judge yourself, where you condemn yourself, can you imagine how good it would feel to experience what Odie's talking about in terms of freedom? Can you imagine into that? Let's take a moment right now just to give you a second to imagine that. It may not be possible, but see if you can. Can you imagine what it would be like to be free of that dark cloud? One way to make this practical is, let me ask a question of you all. Looks like somebody's asking a question here. Somebody's sending thanks to us.
Thank you.
Yeah, for offering this help. That really feels good. Thank you. Appreciate that very much. I know both of us care deeply about this, and we're works in progress.
Yep.
We're both working on this. Let me see if I can ground this in something more practical. I don't know if this will be accessible to you in the audience, but I'd like to invite you to consider, is there a phrase that you can identify that would be that voice of judgment, that voice of condemnation, that voice that would turn you into a turtle and me into a whirlpool down here?
Yeah.
I'll share with you one that I thought of this week. And I was just leading a group before I came in today, and we were discussing this amongst the men about shame, and somebody made the point, and they were right, is that it's so automatic.
Yeah.
And to put it in terms of psychology, it's pre-conscious. We're not even conscious of it. Oftentimes it registers in our body, in our shoulders, or our stomach, or wherever else. It's just so quick, so automatic. The part of the brain, the emotional center of the brain, referred to as the limbic system, moves so quickly is that it bypasses conscious reflection, and you just feel it. So I'm asking us to slow down the frames really slowly to imagine if you could give a word or a phrase to the message that comes up, what might it be that is, in a sense, the voice of the shame? And as I reflected on it this week, one for me that comes up that summarizes all kinds of variations is something like this. What were you thinking? What were you thinking? There's incredible shame in that voice, because the assumption is that obviously I wasn't thinking, or if I was thinking, there was something wrong about that thinking, and it refers to either attitudes or behaviors that I've committed or done that are shameworthy. So if I go back to the previous question, what would it be like? Can you imagine how good it would feel to be free in the way that you were just talking about? To be free from shame. I imagine it to be more concrete. What would it be like to be free of that voice? And to be free of that voice that says to me, what were you thinking, Bobby? Because it always is looking at me as Bobby.
Yeah.
It's the younger self, the immature judged self. What would be a substitute for that phrase? And the next slide actually is what I came up with this week. The substitute for that would be, and has been, Bobby, just remember the baseline from which you come. I'm going to unpack that for a second, because that's not going to make sense necessarily. I find vast reassurance in this. What were you thinking, Bobby? And when I can respond inside, and it's not just a Band-Aid, it's actually from the deepest place. When I remember the places from which I come, both in terms of my life development, in terms of what I have survived and had to grow through, both in terms of the outer environment and the inner body into adulthood that I am and have been, is that if I can remember that baseline and how much work I've done and how much improvement there is, that I've moved from 90% to 10%, then I'm less inclined to judge myself. I'm less inclined to nod in agreement with that judging voice. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, makes perfect sense.
If there's a way that I can find to substitute another phrase besides "what were you thinking," and for me it is this. I actually project this onto others. I'll pretend like it's you, and it wouldn't be you. But if I imagine being judged by you, the imagined conversation would be, Odie, I think you'd be less inclined to judge me if you knew the baseline from which I come. That is, where I started. If you were able to walk in my shoes empathically, I think you'd be less inclined to judge me. And that's all, it's like an imaginary conversation, except it's not imaginary insofar as it's in my head. I have that conversation in my head, whether it's me judging me or imagining you judging me. And if I can find some effective counter to that, I find that helpful. If it's just words, it would be empty words.
Yeah.
It would just be empty words. And so what I want to reference for all of you who've viewed previous episodes, I want to ask that you go back to episodes that we've had that are focused on forgiveness practice. We've had 2 or 3 presentations just strictly on what can I do to learn how to forgive myself.
Yeah.
I can't possibly take us through all of that today. It would take too long, but I can direct you back to presentations that we've done here in the podcast with Franz and with Austin addressing self-forgiveness. Another example, and we spend a lot of time talking about this, is that if I can cultivate gratitude, gratitude for the gifts that have been given me, the opportunities that have been given me on a daily basis, that's an effective counter to self-judgment, because how could a bad person actually have good things happen to them? And so remembering that good things are happening to me and calling attention to that on a regular basis is another counter to self-judgment. And I recommend that you view previous podcasts on the topic of gratitude. A third series of podcasts that we've had address personal creativity. That is, in terms of really being true to your creative self. We just talked about this recently, because I can remember you talking about acting as being one expression of your creative self, and what you're doing these days is another expression of your creativity. Is that I want to recommend that you go back and review our previous podcasts on creativity. So whether it's self-forgiveness or thanksgiving, gratitude, or personal creativity, being true to our own voice, these are all ways in which we can give substance to this phrase of, you don't know where I come from in terms of my baseline. And I've been working really hard at self-forgiveness. I've been working really hard at staying open to gratitudes for graces that have been given me. And I'm trying to do all I can on a daily basis to cultivate personal creativity so that why I'm here on this planet matters. Those all end up supporting this simple phrase of, forgive thyself, Bobby. You're doing okay. You're doing okay. Let me pause there for just a second and see what this stirs up for you. Any thoughts or reflections?
I think it's just, it's very important, the way that you put it, to definitely replace that voice that tells you otherwise. Like for me, like what you shared, for me it's always been a voice of a relative, of a close relative, of saying, you're not good enough to, and then fill in the blank. Or just in general, you're not or you're good for nothing, pretty much. Those two phrases. I noticed growing up that there's been times when I wanted to do something, for example, like a project or something, and having that opportunity come up to actually do a project that I wanted to do, and then just kind of questioning it at first, like, well, am I good enough to do this, and then just working on exactly what you said, replacing that with, well, the baseline where I started, now look at where I'm at right now. So obviously there's a reason why I was given this project, and it's because, I now have skills that I worked at to get to this point. So I think it's important to to replace that voice. So
yeah, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking back to the earlier conversation about the typical English understanding of perfection, which would be in that perspective, anything that's not perfect, you're not good enough. Is that there are not good parts of yourself.
Yeah.
Who do you think you are, Bobby? Who do you think you are, Odie? You're not good enough. And that from this other perspective of perfection, we ascribed it to the ancient Greeks. Their understanding was to be wholly oneself, to be complete. And I think about, like, when you take on a project, is that if you're assigned that project, who they want is Odie Martinez. They don't want somebody else. And if you want Odie Martinez, you get the good with the bad. You get all sides of it. I think of that symbol of yin and yang, of light and dark, kind of interwoven. Is that's who you get.
Yeah.
And what would it be like to extend that to ourselves? Is that I want Odie to show up for this project.
Yeah.
And that means Odie shows up with his strengths. He shows up with his limitations. I want the whole Odie. I want the whole enchilada. You know. And the same with myself. Is that in any given podcast, I'll slip and stumble because I'm human. It's like I get to be Bob Weathers here.
Yeah, exactly.
All of that. And that's perfect
in
the sense of complete. It's not perfect in the sense of not making errors, because I do make errors. We all make errors. And so the Odie and the Bob that show up here for this podcast are ideally the whole and complete Odie and Bob, not partial parts of ourselves. We don't cut out anything.
Yeah.
What I want to suggest, if I could go full circle, is back to the golfing image, is I don't think... Oh, let me ask a question of you, Odie.
Okay.
Have you been around somebody that in a moment is able to extend grace or compassion? You know, you talked about like a family voice in your family that somebody says you're not good enough. Have you been around somebody that you can call to mind that says you are good enough as you are? Can you think of even an experience of that, where you had an experience of somebody seeing all of you, and all of you is good enough?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, my wife is, an immediate instance, a mentor of mine as well. It's another immediate instance. But other than that, outside of that, I mean, friends, family, of course, throughout the ages. But growing up, like the group of friends that I had, unfortunately, we weren't very, per se, vulnerable with each other. So we were very judgmental towards each other. But that's just the way that we connected with each other. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. You give examples of experiences you've had with a mentor and with your wife, where when somebody's able to dispense. I thought of unconditional love when you talked about it.
That's
and
perfect.
I would think of unconditional love being, I know you, like your wife knows you. I know you, the good, the bad, and the ugly, so to speak. And I love who you are. I want to be with you. That's a huge statement right there of acceptance and of embracing all of your Odiness. I talked about the example earlier with Mr. Hayes, my my high school German teacher, who after high school we were friends, and he was really my mentor for 25 years. Very significant in my getting into psychology, because he believed in me and saw something in me, and I never felt judged by him. It was just an incredible experience. He ended up being a spiritual father for me. Is that we can have these windows of grace from people in our lives, and it's a wonderful thing. And it's like, I think what's happened to me in more recent years is, what would it be like to walk around? Mr. Hayes passed away 20 years ago. So he's been out of my life literally for 20 years. He's not out of my life in terms of my prayer time. He's very present with me. He's very present today. And so what would it be like to carry these experiences of grace from people as close as your wife to people in our lives that have touched us, mentors? You mentioned a mentor, I've mentioned a mentor. And that it's not even contingent on them being nearby, or in the case with Mr. Hayes of being physically alive, he's certainly spiritually alive. And what would it be like to cultivate that? And that's what I'm suggesting in terms of moving from a temporary state of grace being bestowed, kind of like holy water, grace being bestowed in a moment, and that registers deeply. But what would it be like to bathe in that holy water till that becomes our home.
Yeah.
That becomes our home. And I do believe that that's possible with the kinds of things that we've suggested over the course of this series on unshaming, is to practice some form of quiet reflection, prayer, meditation, where you cultivate grace and compassion, just as your wife gives to you, Odie gives to you. Just as Mr. Hayes gave and continues to give to me, Bob gives to me, is that with practice we can actually become a master of, how do I want to put this, kind of a master of ourselves amidst limitation. It allows us to be limited and to be perfect in that ancient Greek sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that. That's good.
I've got a picture to show you guys. So little Bobby learned this message at age 14. Didn't realize that 48 years later, 49 years later, let's get the timing right. 49 years later, I'd be talking about Üben macht den Meister. Here's a slide, the next slide. Here's a slide that's very close to that poster that hung up in the front of Mr. Hayes' class. Here it is, you guys. Üben macht den Meister. That's pretty doggone close to it right there. I stared at that every week for 4 years in high school. I never forgot that. And so if today's topic, we introduced it earlier, is practice makes perfect, the next slide has a little asterisk. Practice makes perfect in the Greek sense. And so I hope that you can remember that today. And so what we're talking about, it's a beautiful example you gave, Odie, is for us to spend time habitually in the presence of those that are able to see through this kind of wise compassion. And it's a blessing that you have that with your wife, and that you've had a taste of that in your life. And I've had that in my life as well. And then what can we do to cultivate that more consciously in whatever we do in our daily discipline around quiet time, prayer, meditation? I think that's gold.
Yeah.
I think it's gold.
Absolutely.
And I feel like that all of our conversations are rooted in experience, and I really appreciate you always bringing your firsthand experience. Both of us have intimate acquaintanceship with addiction, with enslavement, and both of us have a taste and a yearning for freedom.
Yeah.
And this is an example of how we can move from glimpses of freedom to it becoming more and more a permanent stage, a permanent location for us, a permanent residence for us. And I vote for that.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I
thank you.
vote.
Yeah, thank you. Thank all of you for joining us today. In a very similar vein, an extension of this conversation today, next week we'll be talking about surprising shame with love. You'll have to come back for me and for us to unpack that. I've already been working on that one for next week, and I'm looking forward to your coming back. Surprising shame with love. That's really what we've been talking about today in a way, is that love, real love, unconditional love, has the possibility of substituting for shame that would bind us, that would drag us down, that would paralyze us. The kind of love that you're describing is liberating.
Yeah. That's good.
And I would wish for each one of us here today to find more and more portals or avenues to accessing that love and carrying that with us increasingly, both in our relationships in the outer world, but also our relationship to ourselves in the inner world. And I want to thank you for joining us. We're talking about the genuine long-term antidote to shame, and has everything to do with living lives that are free of enslavement or free from addiction. I want to invite any final questions if anyone has that. Mr. Armstrong?
Not at this time.
Not at this time. I want to invite you to send your questions to the Facebook group, Ask an Addiction Specialist, or to YouTube. The next slide, you'll see my professional website here. There's a contact me place on my website where you can write questions to me, and you can address those to Odie and me, and be happy to address those. I want to encourage you, more so than I think ever before today, to review what we've created over the course of almost a full year now. There are a tremendous number of resources for beginning different angles and how you can cultivate what Odie and I are talking about today, not only in your relationships in the outer world, which are critical, I believe, but also your relationship to yourself in the inner world. And so really hope that you'll hearken to that recommendation and go back and check out our previous podcasts addressing, for example, self-forgiveness, addressing daily gratitudes, addressing what we can do to cultivate personal creativity. So come back next week to surprise shame with love. Thank you for joining us today. It's been a blessing having you with us. Thanks, Odie.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.